Your mom told me you're just a pushover Jack. Said I could cheat on you anytime and you'd never notice. Maggie's voice slurred through the cool September air. Her words slicing into me like a rusted blade as she stumbled, collapsing into my arms with a drunken giggle. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. The stuffed bear I just won her at the ring toss booth slipping from my hand to the dirt below. We were at the county fair. 5 miles outside our little Oregon town of Cloverdale. Surrounded by the hum of small-town America. Kids squealing as they darted between booths. Their faces sticky with cotton candy. And retirees like us soaking in the glow of a night we'd waited for all year. At 62, I'd traded my mechanic's wrench for Eve like this with Maggie 58, her hazel eyes glassy now. Unfocused as she looked up at me, her auburn hair a mess under the fair's twinkling lights. She hiccuped, then passed out, her head lolling against my chest, leaving me standing there, stunned, as her confession echoed in my skull. The fairground noise. Kids shouting, the bluegrass band strumming, Sweet Home Alabama, on a stage framed by 10-foot hay bales, faded to a dull roar as I processed what she'd said. My mother, Ruth 85, had told my wife of 35 years I'd never notice her cheating. The thought hit me like a 12-pound sledgehammer, cracking the foundation of everything I'd built with Maggie. Coffee mornings, quiet evenings, promises whispered in the dark of our farmhouse 5 miles away. I guided her to a hay bale bench, her snoring soft against my flannel shirt, and stared at her peaceful face, the lantern glow casting shadows over her features. For seniors like us, trust was sacred. 35 years wasn't just time, it was a vow. And now, that vow felt like it was crumbling under the weight of her wine-soaked words. Was it just drunken nonsense, or had Ruth's sharp tongue planted a seed Maggie had nurtured? My knees buckled. But I held steady. The bear lying forgotten in the dirt, its button eyes staring blankly as I wrestled with the shock ripping through me. We'd started the night with dinner at the Rusty Barn, a cozy spot 2 miles from the fairgrounds, known for its 12-ounce ribeyes that melted like butter. Maggie had been all smiles then, her hand in mine as we strolled into the fair, the air thick with fried duff and popcorn. Slice of Americana older folks like us cherished. The Ferris wheel creaked 50 feet high, booths brimmed with homemade jams. And I'd won that bear with a steady aim, a little triumph that had her clapping like we were kids again. Jack Larson, still got it. She'd teased, tucking the prize under her arm as we grabbed mulled wine from a vendor, the cinnamon, spiced warmth spreading through us. She usually stopped at 1 glass. 2 if she felt wild. But tonight, she'd downed 4, her grin widening with each sip. I'd matched her, something I hadn't done in years, and it felt good. Free, like we were shedding the dust of our routines under the Oregon sky. She'd tug me onto the dance floor after that 3rd glass. The crowd parting to give us room, her laughter ringing out like a bell. Maggie's always been a magnet. Her hair catching the light, her joy contagious, and a few guys in scuff boots tried to cut in, offering twirls with hopeful grins. Just like always, she waved them off. No thanks. I've got my man. Her hand squeezing mine tighter, a moment that swelled my chest with pride. We'd swayed to the music, the band switching to a slower tune, and I'd thought this was a night to tuck away. Until she stumbled off the floor, fumbling with her jacket, smacking herself with her purse, and tripping into me. You're my husband, right? She'd slurred, giggling, and I'd chuckled. Pretty sure, yeah. Already bracing to hold her hair back instead of stealing a kiss. Then came that bombshell, out of nowhere, her giggle turning to a hiccup as she blurted Ruth's words, shattering the fair's magic like glass under a boot. I stood there, the cool night air brushing my face, feeling like the ground had dropped 10 feet beneath me. Ruth lived 3 miles away, her cottage a constant presence, her voice a blade I dulled with patience. But this, telling Maggie I'd never notice her cheating, that wasn't a jab. It was a betrayal of everything I'd poured into this marriage. 35 years of fixing leaks, holding her through tears, waking to her coffee brewing 8 ounces strong. Had Ruth said it once, or had she drilled it into Maggie over tea, 3 miles from here, while I'm out her lawn? And Maggie, why laugh it out now, after all this time? For older Americans like us, family's a rock, not a wrecking ball, and Ruth had swung hard. I looked at Maggie, asleep in my arms, and felt the sting of shock give way to a question I couldn't bury. Was my wife the woman I'd trusted, or had Ruth turned her into someone I'd never see coming? The next morning came too soon. The dawn creeping through the curtains of our farmhouse kitchen. A modest 500 square foot haven we'd built 30 years ago on a 10-acre plot surrounded by whispering pines and open pasture. I was up before the roosters, my hand steady despite the storm brewing in my chest, pouring batter onto the griddle for pancakes, a ritual as old as our marriage. The smell of sizzling butter filled the air, mingling with the sharp tang of coffee I'd brewed. Ounces strong, black as tar, the way I'd taken it since my days wrenching engines at Cloverdale Auto. At 62, I'd left that life behind, but the habit stuck, grounding me as I flipped golden discs onto a plate, trying to outrun the echo of Maggie's words from the fair. She'd slept like a rock on the ride home, 5 miles of winding road passing in silence, her head against the window of our old pickup. Now, I needed answers, and the kitchen table, oak, sanded smooth by my own hands decades ago, was where I'd get them. Maggie shuffled in just shy of noon, her auburn hair a wild tangle. Still in her flannel pajamas, blue with little white stars, a Christmas gift from me years back. She looked beautiful, even hungover. Her hazel eyes half lidded as she grabbed a mug from the cupboard and poured herself some coffee. She slumped into the chair beside me, the wood creaking under her, and we sat in silence. The only sounds the ticking of the wall clock and the faint mooing of cows from the neighbor's field a half-mile away. I watched her sip, her hands wrapping around the mug like it was a lifeline, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. Setting my coffee down, I turned to her, my voice low but firm, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Maggie, what did you mean last night, about Mom saying I'm a pushover you could cheat on? Her brow creased, a flicker of confusion crossing her face before she let out a soft, sleepy laugh. Oh honey, it was just Ruth being Ruth. You know how bossy she gets. I was 3 sheets to the wind. She waved a hand like she was shooing a pesky fly, reaching for a pancake with a tired smile, her fingers brushing the syrup bottle. But her dodge didn't sit right with me. Ruth being Ruth didn't explain why Maggie thought it was funny, or why she'd repeated it like it was some private joke. So she said it, and you just laughed it off. I pressed, my fingers tightening around my mug, the heat seeping into my palms. Jack, come on, she said. Her tone light but edged with a hint of impatience, like I was a kid asking too many questions. It's nothing. I don't even remember half of what I said. 4 glasses of wine'll do that to you. She took a bite of pancake, avoiding my eyes, and I stared at the steam curling up from my coffee, feeling a knot twist tighter in my chest. For older folks like us, words weren't just wind. They carried weight, especially when they came from family. Ruth at 85, had always been a force. Her sharp tongue a constant in my life, but this. Telling my wife I'd never notice her cheating. That wasn't just bossy. That was a betrayal of everything I'd built with Maggie over 35 years. I'd spent my life proving I wasn't weak. Working 12-hour shifts to keep us afloat, fixing every leaky pipe in this house, holding her through the darkest nights. And now, I wondered if Maggie saw me the way Ruth did, a pushover, too soft to hold on to what mattered. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick, like a fog rolling in off the coast 50 miles west. Maggie finished her pancake, stood, and carried our mugs to the sink. A habit I'd once found sweet, a little dance of domesticity we'd perfected over decades. She rinsed them under the faucet, the water splashing against the porcelain, and I watched her back, the way her shoulders moved, searching for a sign. Guilt maybe, or regret. But she just hummed a tune I didn't recognize, drying her hands on a dish towel before turning to me with a small smile. You're overthinking this, Jack, she said, her voice gentle but dismissive, like she was patting a worried dog on the head. It was just the wine talking. She shuffled back to the bedroom, leaving me alone at the table, the clock ticking louder now, each second a hammer against my skull. I wanted to believe her. Lord knows I did. Maggie and I had weathered storms together, from lean years when the garage barely paid to the quiet ache of losing her folks 10 years back. But that fairground confession gnawed at me, a splinter I couldn't pull out. Ruth lived 3 miles down the road, her cottage a constant presence, and I'd always chalked her barbs up to age and grief. She'd lost Dad 15 years ago, and loneliness sharpened her edges. But this wasn't a barb, it was a blade, aimed at the heart of my marriage. Had she said it once, in passing, or had she drilled it into Maggie over time? And Maggie, why bring it up now, after all these years? I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under my 180 pounds, and stared out the window at the pines swaying in the breeze. For seniors like us, trust was sacred. 35 years wasn't just time, it was a promise. But as Maggie's humming faded down the hall, I felt that promise waver, and I knew I couldn't let it go. Not yet, not until I understood what lay beneath her words. The days after that kitchen standoff blurred into a restless haze, my mind drifting back to the roots of this mess. Ruth, my mother, and the shadow she'd cast over my life. Sitting at my workbench in the barn that afternoon, I sanded a birdhouse I'd been crafting. A 12-inch cedar beauty for the senior center raffle. Trying to smooth out the rough edges of my thoughts. The barn smelled of sawdust and oil. A sanctuary 50 feet from the farmhouse where I'd spent countless hours tinkering since retirement. At 62, my hands still knew their way around a tool, steady from decades as a mechanic. But today they faltered, pausing as memories of Ruth flooded in. She lived 3 miles down the road in a cottage I'd painted myself after Dad passed 15 years ago. her white hair pulled tight in a bun, her voice always carrying that edge of command. Growing up, she'd called me, too soft. Scolding me for fixing bikes for free or crying when our old hound Rusty died at 14. No backbone. Jack, she'd say, hands on her hips, her 5'2" frame somehow towering over me. But I'd proven her wrong, or so I thought. When Maggie lost her bookkeeping job at 50, plunging into a depression that dimmed her light for nearly a year, I didn't flinch. I took extra shifts at Cloverdale Auto, driving 20 miles each way to keep the bills paid. My pickup rattling over potholed roads. Nights, I'd sit with her on our sagging couch, holding her through tear-soaked silences until she found her footing again. Ruth never saw that strength. She only saw the quiet man who mowed her lawn every Saturday, 3 acres of grass I kept neat out of duty, not weakness. I'd haul my old push mower over in the bed of my truck, sweat soaking my shirt under the Oregon sun, and she'd watch from her porch, sipping iced tea, never once saying thanks. To her, I was still the boy who'd rather fix a neighbor's tractor than fight for a raise. Pushover, not a provider. Maggie had been my anchor through it all. We'd met at a barn dance when I was 27. Her twirling in a sundress, me too shy to ask until she grabbed my hand and pulled me onto the floor. She'd laughed at my 2 left feet, her hazel eyes sparkling, and I'd fallen hard. Over 35 years. We'd built this life. Our farmhouse, our routines, our love. She'd tease me about my Old Spice aftershave, the same bottle I'd used since our wedding day, and I'd rib her about burning toast every Sunday. But Ruth never warmed to her, always muttering about Maggie's city ways. Even though she'd grown up just 10 miles from here, in a clapboard house by the river, I defended Maggie every time, brushing off Ruth's jabs as harmless griping. Her way of copping after Dad's heart gave out at 68. I'd check on her weekly, fixing her leaky faucets or hauling firewood 4 feet high into her shed, telling myself it was what sons do. Maggie'd roll her eyes. You're too good to her, Jack. But I'd shrug. Family was family. Now though, those words from the fair. You're just a pushover, Jack, you'd never notice. Cut deeper than Ruth's usual barbs. Had she said it once, in a fit of spite? Or had she whispered it over years, planting seeds in Maggie's mind? I set the birdhouse down, its edges smooth but my thoughts jagged, and leaned back on my stool, the barn's tin roof creaking in the wind. Ruth had always been a force. After Dad died, she'd taken charge of everything, from his estate to my life, barking orders like a drill sergeant. I'd let her, out of respect, out of habit. But this wasn't about a leaky faucet or a mowed lawn. This was my marriage, the one thing I'd fought tooth and nail to protect. When Maggie's depression hit, I'd stayed late at the garage, hands black with grease, to cover her therapy. 50 a session, twice a week. I'd cooked dinners, burned a few, and learned to listen when she couldn't speak. That wasn't weakness. That was love. The kind seniors like us understand after decades of give and take. I thought of the senior center, where I'd started volunteering last year, teaching chair yoga to folks in their 70s and 80s. Widows and vets who'd nod at me with respect as I guided them through stretches. You've got a steady hand, Jack, old Mr. Hensley'd say, his cane tapping the floor. I'd smile, feeling useful, strong in a way Ruth never saw. Maggie'd come sometimes, watching from the back with a proud grin, but Ruth, she'd scoff if I mentioned it. Yoga. That's for hippies, not men. Her disdain had never shaken me before, but now I wondered if it'd shaken Maggie. Had she listened to Ruth's venom over coffee at that cottage, 3 miles away, while I was out fixing someone's carburetor? Had she started to see me as the man Ruth described? Too soft, too blind to hold her. I picked up the sandpaper again, running it over the birdhouse. Each stroke a silent vow, I wasn't that man. I'd carried us through storms, and I'd carry us through this. If only I could trust what Maggie saw in me. The weeks after that fairground bombshell stretched into a slow, suffocating unraveling, each day threading new doubts into the fabric of our life at the farmhouse. I'd wake to the roosters crowing beyond our 10-acre plot, the pines swaying 50 feet from the porch, and try to bury the H in routine coffee. Pancakes, the hum of Cloverdale waking up 5 miles away. But Maggie started acting different, small shifts that piled up like pebbles in my boots. Thursday nights, she'd announce, book club, at the library 15 miles into town, her purse slung over her shoulder. A quick, see you later, hon, tossed my way as she grabbed the keys to our pickup. She'd roll back past 10 p.m., her cheeks flushed, a faint whiff of cologne clinging to her jacket. Not mine, not the Old Spice I'd worn since I was 20. I'd ask, casual as I could muster, good book tonight? And she'd nod, humming some tune I didn't know, her eyes darting away like a deer spooked by headlights. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was seeing ghosts where there were none. But the signs kept stacking, heavy and inignorable. Her phone buzzed late at night. 11 p.m., midnight. Vibrations rattling the nightstand in our bedroom, 12 feet from the kitchen where I'd sit with a glass of water, pretending not to notice. She'd swipe it silent, muttering, "Just Sally." But her fingers lingered on the screen too long. One morning, rummaging for my keys in her coat pocket, I found a crumpled receipt. 2 coffees, the 6 bar 50. From a diner 20 miles out, dated a Tuesday she'd claimed to be at Sally's, 3 miles down the road. "Just catching up," she'd said that night, kicking off her boots with a yawn. But Sally didn't drink coffee. Only tea, ever since her ulcer flared up 5 years back. I held that receipt, the paper crinkling in my hand, and felt my stomach twist like I'd swallowed a wrench. For seniors like us, trust isn't just a word. It's the glue of 35 years, the quiet promise in every shared glance over breakfast. Maggie and I had danced through life together. From that first barn twirl when I was 27 to slow waltzes in our living room, her head on my chest as the radio crackled. I'd always trusted her, never snooped, never doubted. Her ladder was my compass. Her touch my anchor. But now, every time she smiled too wide or laughed too long at nothing, I wondered if Ruth's words, "You'd never notice," had taken root. I started a garden out back to keep my hands busy. 4-foot rows of heirloom tomatoes, the kind my granddad grew, their seeds a gift from Pete down at the feed store. Digging in the dirt. I'd feel the sun on my back, the soil cool under my nails, and for a moment, I could breathe, the rhythm of planting drowning out the noise in my head. But then I'd see Maggie on the porch, texting someone. Her thumbs flying over the screen, and the piece would slip away like water through my fingers. I'd lie awake at night, the mattress creaking under my 180 pounds, staring at the ceiling 8 feet above while she slept beside me, her breathing soft and even. Was she cheating? Had Ruth's venom convinced her I was too soft to care? The thought clawed at me, sharp and relentless. I'd hear her humming those unfamiliar tunes. Jazzy little riffs, not the country songs we'd always loved. And wonder where they came from. One evening, she came home from book club with a new scarf. Red silk, knotted loose around her neck. Something she'd never buy herself. "Sally gave it to me," she said when I asked, but her voice hitched. And Sally wasn't the type for gifts like that. I'd seen her linger at the mailbox too, 30 feet from the house, flipping through envelopes like she was waiting for something special. Something I wasn't meant to see. I tried talking myself down. Standing in that garden with a spade in hand, the tomato plants sprouting 6 inches high now, their green leaves a quiet promise of growth. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was planning a surprise. Like the time she'd secretly saved for a fishing rod 10 years back, handing it to me with a grin on my 52nd birthday. But this felt different, heavier. Ruth's cottage loomed in my mind, 3 miles away. Her voice echoing, "You can easily cheat on him." Had she said it over tea one afternoon, her sharp tongue slicing into Maggie's doubts? Had Maggie listened? Testing the waters because she thought I'd never push back. I'd spent my life proving I wasn't weak. Working 12-hour shifts at the garage, hauling 4-foot stacks of firewood for Ruth. Holding Maggie through her darkest days when depression stole her smile. But now, every creak of the floorboards as she moved through the house felt like a question. Did she see me as Ruth did? A man too blind to hold her. The senior center became my refuge, a 2-mile drive where I'd teach chair yoga to folks in their 70s and 80s. Widows stretching their arms, vets nodding as I counted breaths. "Steady as a rock, Jack," they'd say, and I'd feel a flicker of pride, a reminder I wasn't the pushover Ruth claimed. But at home, that pride withered under Maggie's secrets. I'd watch her from the kitchen window, her silhouette against the porch light, and wonder who she was texting. Someone who smelled of cologne, who drank coffee at diners 20 miles away. For older Americans like us, marriage is a pact forged in time. 35 years of shared coffee, patched roofs, and quiet nights. But as those weeks wore on, that pact felt like it was fraying, thread by thread, and I knew I couldn't bury my head in the garden forever. Something was coming, and I'd have to face it. Whether I was ready or not. By the time the 4th of July rolled around, I'd hit my breaking point, the weight of Maggie's secrets pressing down like a 200-pound engine block I couldn't lift alone. The town picnic at Cloverdale Park, 2 miles from our farmhouse, was in full swing. 12-foot flagpoles waving red, white, and blue, the air thick with the smoky tang of barbecue, and the sweet promise of apple pie. It was the kind of day seniors like us lived for. Kids chasing fireflies, neighbors swapping stories over picnic tables, and fireworks painting the sky in bursts of color. Maggie and I walked the grounds. Her arm looped through mine, but it felt mechanical, like we were actors in a play we'd outgrown. She wore a denim skirt, and a smile that didn't reach her hazel eyes. And I carried a thermos of iced tea, 16 ounces, brewed strong the way she liked it, trying to hold on to normalcy. But every step crunched with the gravel of doubt, and I couldn't play pretend anymore. The mayor fired up the first fireworks, a rocket screaming 100 feet into the night, and the crowd oohed as red and gold bloomed overhead. I pulled Maggie aside near the pie booth, the scent of cinnamon wafting from a table stacked 3 feet high with desserts. "Maggie," I said, my voice steady despite the tremble in my gut, "tell me straight. Did you cheat on me because of what Mom said?" Her eyes widened, then narrowed, her cheeks flushing under the firework glow. "Jack, for heaven's sake. Ruth's nonsense got in my head, okay?" She snapped, her words sharp as a whip. "I've been seeing someone for advice, that's all." Her dodge hit me like a punch, vague and slippery. "Advice about what?" I pressed, stepping closer, the crowd's chatter fading behind us. "Life, Jack. I don't know," she shot back, turning away as another rocket exploded, casting her face in flickering light. "That's not an answer," I said louder now, my hands balling into fists at my sides. She huffed, crossing her arms, and walked off toward the bandstand, leaving me rooted there, the thermos dangling from my hand. That wasn't enough. Not after weeks of late nights, cologne and coffee receipts. I drove home alone, the fireworks fading to pinpricks in my rearview, the 2-mile stretch a tunnel of dark pines and unanswered questions. But I didn't stop at the farmhouse. I kept going. 3 miles down the winding road to Ruth's cottage, her porch light a dim beacon against the night. She answered the door in her nightgown, her white hair loose around her shoulders, her smirk as sharp as the cane she leaned on. "What's this about Jack?" she asked, her voice cutting through the cricket's hum. I didn't waste time. "Did you tell Maggie I'm a pushover she could cheat on?" I demanded, my breath fogging in the cool air, my voice rising over the rustle of leaves 20 feet away. She didn't blink, her gray eyes locking onto mine. "You're too weak to keep her, Jack. Always have been," she said, her words cold and deliberate, like she'd been waiting to say them. That lit a fire in me, hot and fierce. I wasn't weak. I'd rebuilt engines with my bare hands, held Maggie through despair when her world went dark, mowed this woman's lawn for 15 years without a word of thanks. "You don't get to decide my worth," I said, my voice low but hard, each syllable a hammer strike. "I've carried this family. Carried you. When you couldn't stand alone. You've got no right to tear me down." Her smirk faltered, just for a second, but she straightened, gripping her cane tighter. "You'll see," she muttered, turning back inside, the door clicking shut behind her. I stood there, the night pressing in, my heart pounding like a drum. For seniors like us, family's supposed to be a rock, not a blade. But Ruth had cut me deep, and I wasn't letting it bleed me out. I drove back to the farmhouse, the 5-mile loop a blur, and parked in the garage where my 1965 Ford truck sat. A rusted beauty I'd been restoring for months. Wrench in hand, I tightened a bolt on the engine, the metal cool under my fingers, each turn a silent vow. I wasn't the man Ruth saw, too soft, too blind. I'd spent 35 years proving that. From the 12-hour shifts at Cloverdale Auto to the nights I'd sat up with Maggie, her tears soaking my shirt when depression stole her voice. I'd hauled firewood 4 feet high into Ruth's shed, fixed her roof after storms tore through, all while she called me spineless. The truck's hood gleamed under the garage light, 6 feet of steel I'd brought back to life. Proof I could rebuild anything. Even this. Maggie's half-truths at the picnic weren't enough. I needed the whole story, and I'd get it, not by begging, but by standing tall. The senior center flashed in my mind, where I taught chair yoga 2 miles away. Folks in their 70s and 80s stretching under my guidance, calling me steady, reliable. I'd started that last year, a way to give back, and their smiles had built me up when Ruth tore me down. Maggie'd watch sometimes, proud, but Ruth, she'd scoff. "Yoga's for hippies, not men." Her disdain had never shaken me before, but now it fueled me. I set the wrench down, the truck's engine humming in my imagination, and felt a resolve settle in my bones. I wasn't weak. I'd carried us through worse than this. And I'd carry us through now. Ruth's words had sparked something in Maggie, and I'd confront it head on. Not as a pushover, but as the man I'd always been. One who fought for what mattered. Even when the fight was with his own blood. The next week stretched taut as a wire, Maggie's evasions from the picnic looping in my head like a scratched record. I couldn't sit still. Couldn't let it fester. I needed the truth, and I wasn't waiting for her handed to me wrapped in a bow. I called Pete, my buddy from the truck runs. A grizzled vet with a gray beard and a pickup that rattled like loose change. We met over coffee at the diner 5 miles from Cloverdale, a hole in the wall with vinyl booths and a jukebox stuck on Johnny Cash. "Something's off with Maggie," I told him, stirring my 8-ounce black coffee, the steam curling up like my doubts. "She's been sneaking around, late nights. Cologne that ain't mine. Help me figure it out." Pete nodded, no questions asked, his hazel eyes steady behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Say no more, Jack. I've got your back," he said, slapping a $5 bill on the counter as we headed out. That Thursday we tailed her in his truck, keeping 100 feet back as she drove our pickup 8 miles to Millwood, a sleepy town with a main street barely 500 feet long. She parked outside a cafe. The Brew Barn, a quaint spot with flower boxes and a chalkboard sign toting $3 lats. Through the window, I saw her with him. Tom, a silver-haired guy, maybe 60, with a warm smile and a teacher's posture, his hands gesturing over a table littered with coffee cups. Maggie laughed, her auburn hair catching the light, her hand brushing his as she reached for her mug. My stomach sank, a cold weight settling in my gut, and Pete snapped photos with his old Nikon, the clicks loud in the cab. "That him?" Pete asked, lowering the camera. "Looks like it," I muttered, my throat tight, my fingers gripping the door handle. They sat there for an hour. 60 minutes that felt like a lifetime. Her head tilting close, his eyes crinkling with a grin. But I didn't storm in, didn't let rage take the wheel. I needed more than a snapshot. I needed the whole picture. The next day, I tracked Tom down at his barbershop job. 4 miles from the cafe, a red building with a striped pole spinning lazily out front. I parked my truck 20 feet away, the engine ticking as it cooled, and walked in, the bell jingling overhead. He was sweeping clippings, his 6-foot frame stooped slightly, and he looked up with a friendly nod. "Haircut?" he asked, setting the broom aside. "No," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I'm Jack Larson, Maggie's husband. You seeing her?" His eyes widened, surprise flashing across his face. And he raised his hands like I'd pulled a gun. "Maggie, just talking, she's been low, needed a friend. Ruth's been on her case." "Nothing physical, Jack, I swear." His words came fast, honest. And I studied him, his gray sweater, his calloused hands, the sincerity in his tone. "What's Ruth got to do with it?" I pressed, stepping closer, the scent of aftershave sharp in the air. "She's been telling Maggie you're weak, that you can't handle her struggles. Maggie's been down. Depression again, I think." "I've just been listening," he said, meeting my gaze. That disarmed me. But the hurt lingered, a dull ache in my chest. Tom wasn't lying. I'd seen that look in Maggie's eyes before, the shadow that crept in when her mind turned dark. Ruth had widened that crack. Her words. "You'd never notice." A match to Maggie's old insecurities. It wasn't an affair, not yet, but it was a drift. A lifeline she'd grabbed because she thought I couldn't hold her up. I drove home, the 10-mile stretch a blur of pines and gravel, and sat in my garden, the tomato plants now 2 feet tall, their green leaves swaying in the breeze 30 feet from the barn. I'd carried us through her depression once. Hell, 12-hour shifts, the 50 therapy sessions, nights of burned dinners. And I could do it again. But this time, I'd turn Ruth's poison into power, not pain. Tom's honesty gave me a thread to pull, and I'd weave it into something stronger. I thought of the Veterans Fishing Club I joined last month, casting lines 50 feet into Clover Lake with guys who'd faced wars and won. Men in their 70s who'd slap my back and call me, solid as oak. We'd all in trout, 10-pound beauties. And share stories over a fire pit 6 feet wide, the crackle of logs drowning out the world. Their camaraderie bolstered me, a new lifeline Ruth couldn't touch, and I'd felt my spine stiffen with every cast. Back home, I'd kneel in that garden, the soil cool under my knees, and see Maggie through the kitchen window, her silhouette soft against the light. She wasn't cheating. Not physically. But she'd leaned on Tom because Ruth had convinced her I was too soft to lean on. I wasn't weak. I'd rebuilt a 1965 Ford truck, taught yoga to seniors, held this family together for 35 years. For older Americans like us, marriage is a pact forged in sweat and silence, and I'd fight to keep it, not as a pushover, but as a man who knew his worth. The harvest dance at the senior center came 2 weeks later, and I knew it was my chance. My moment to pull the truth into the light, and reclaim what Ruth had tried to steal. The barn glowed with lanterns strung 10 feet high, 6-foot hay bales lining the walls, the air alive with the scrape of fiddles and the stomp of square dancing. 4 couples per set, twirling in perfect sync under a ceiling 20 feet above. Cloverdale's retirees filled the space, 200 strong. Their laughter bouncing off the rafters as the band played, Rocky Top. Maggie wore a denim skirt, her auburn hair pinned up, and we danced at first, her steps hesitant, her hand loose in mine. She'd been quieter since the picnic, her book club nights tapering off, but the shadow of Tom and Ruth still hung between us, a 5-pound weight dragging us apart. I'd spent the week in my garden, the tomatoes now 3 feet tall, and at the fishing club pulling 12-pound trout from the lake 50 feet out, steeling myself for this. The music shifted to a waltz, slow and tender. And I felt the crowd's eyes. Folks who'd known us for decades, who'd waved from porches 2 miles down the road. I couldn't let this fester any longer. I stepped to the bandstand, my boots thudding on the wooden floor, and took the mic from the bandlitter, my heart pounding like a jackhammer. "Folks," I said, my voice carrying over the hush, "I've got something to say. My mother, Ruth, told my wife I'm a pushover she could cheat on. Said I'd never notice. Well, I'm not. And I did. Gasps rippled through the room, a wave of whispers breaking against the hay bales. Maggie froze 10 feet away, her face pale under the lantern glow, her hazel eyes wide. Jack, don't. She whispered, but I kept going, the mic cool in my hand. Maggie's been leaning on someone else, and Ruth pushed her to it. I'm no weakling. I've held this family together for 35 years, through storms you all know about. My voice cracked, but I stood tall. 6 feet of resolve in a flannel shirt and jeans. Ruth was in the back, her white hair a stark contrast to the shadows, her cane tapping the floor as she glared. Maggie stepped forward, tears glistening, her voice trembling. It's true. Ruth got in my head. Tom's just a friend, Jack. I was lost, and she made me think you couldn't handle it. The crowd hushed, seniors leaning in. Widows in quilted vests, vets with weathered hands. Folks who'd seen us at church 2 miles away, who'd bought my birdhouses at the fair. I've been low again, Maggie said, softer now. Depression creeping back. Tom listened when I couldn't talk to you. But it's my fault. I should have come to you. Her words hit me like a warm wind, raw and real. And I saw the Maggie I'd married. The one who'd twirled with me at 23, who'd cried in my arms at 50. Ruth snorted, turning on her heel, her cane a furious staccato as she stormed out. The barn door slamming 15 feet behind her. I lowered the mech, the fiddles picking up again, and the crowd parted as Maggie walked to me, her skirt swishing. I'm sorry, Jack, she said, wiping her face with a shaky hand. I let Ruth twist me up. I nodded, the weight lifting, not gone, but lighter, a burden shared now. I can handle anything, I said, my voice soft but firm. But not lies. She took my hand, her fingers warm against mine, and we stood there, the waltz swirling around us like a promise renewed. For seniors like us, truth is a lifeline. 35 years isn't just time, it's a tapestry of trust, and Ruth had tried to unravel it. Her exit was her defeat, a public humbling in front of Cloverdale's heart. And Maggie's confession was a start. Crack letting light back in. I'd taught chair yoga here, 2 miles from home. Guiding folks through stretches on chairs lined 10 feet apart, their smiles a balm to Ruth's cuts. Now, those same folks clapped. Old Mr. Hensley tapping his cane, widows nodding like they'd known all along. The square dancing resumed, boots stomping 4 feet from us, and I felt a swell of pride, not just for me, but for us. Ruth had misjudged me, and Maggie had stumbled, but this barn, this community, saw the man I was, steady, strong, no pushover. I'd hauled firewood 4 feet high for Ruth, rebuilt a truck from rust, planted a garden 30 feet from this very barn where tomatoes grew 3 feet tall. Maggie squeezed my hand, her tears drying. And I knew we weren't done. Not yet. The fiddles sang, the lanterns glowed, and for older Americans like us, this was more than a dance. It was a reckoning, a chance to stitch our pact back together, thread by thread, under the Oregon stars. The weeks after the harvest dance felt like a fresh dawn. The air crisp with possibility as Maggie and I stepped back from the edge Ruth had pushed us toward. We signed up for couples counseling at St. Mary's Church, 2 miles down the road. A 10-week program with Pastor Jim, who'd married us 35 years ago under an oak tree 50 feet from the steeple. The first session was raw, Maggie sitting across from me in a pew, her hands twisting a tissue as she spilled it all. Ruth got in my head, Jack, she said, her hazel eyes wet but steady. She'd say it over tea. He's too soft, Maggie, he'll never notice. When I started feeling low again, I believed her. Tom was just a friend, I swear it, but I should have come to you. I nodded, my throat tight. Seeing the woman I'd loved through decades of laughter and tears. I've always handled it, I said, my voice low, and I'll handle this too. But no more secrets. Pastor Jim smiled, his glasses glinting under the stained glass, and we left that church holding hands, the 2-mile drive home a quiet promise. Ruth stayed away, her pride stung raw by that public reckoning, and I made it clear. No more meddling, or she'd see me even less than the 3 miles between us allowed. I drove to her cottage one morning, the 1965 Ford truck rumbling under me, and stood on her porch 10 feet from her rocker. You don't get to twist my life anymore, I said, my voice firm as the oak planks beneath me. I've mowed your lawn, fixed your roof, 4-foot stacks of shingles in the rain, and you call me weak. We're done with that. She glared, her cane tapping, but said nothing, the silence her surrender. I sold that truck the next week, $5,000 cash from a collector 20 miles out, and turned our barn into a woodworking shop. The space 50 feet from the farmhouse hummed with new life. Saws buzzing, cedar shavings curling under my hands as I crafted birdhouses and rocking chairs, each piece a testament to the strength Ruth couldn't see. Maggie joined me in the garden, her hands in the soil beside mine, planting marigolds alongside the tomatoes. Now 4 feet tall, their red fruit heavy with promise. These are for us, she said one afternoon, her auburn hair tied back, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. We'd kneel there 30 feet from the barn, The sun dipping low over our 10-acre plot, and her ladder rang out again. Clear bright, the sound I'd fallen for at 23. Counseling peeled back layers. Her depression had crept in months ago, a shadow she'd hidden, and Ruth's words had preyed on it, convincing her I couldn't cope. I was wrong, she'd say, her voice soft as we washed dishes, the sink 6 feet from the table where we'd faced off that morning after the fair. You're the strongest man I know. I'd dry my hands, pull her close, and feel the pact of 35 years knit back together, not perfect but ours. I'd started at the Veterans Fishing Club, casting lines 50 feet into Clover Lake with guys who'd seen wars and won. Men in their 70s who'd slap my back over a fire pit 6 feet wide, calling me solid as oak. That bolstered me, but the shop was I hosted a craft fair that fall, tables 10 feet long lined with $5 birdhouses and $50 rockers, neighbors crowding the barn 2 miles from town. Jack Larson, the comeback kid. Old Mr. Hensley chuckled, buying a chair, his cane tapping the dirt. Seniors clapped me on the back, widows in quilted vests nodding like they'd known I'd rise. Maggie sold lemonade. 16 ounces a glass, tart and sweet. Her smile wide as she worked beside me, the marigolds blooming 30 feet away, a splash of gold against the pines. For older Americans like us, community's a lifeline, and Cloverdale saw me, not a pushover but a man who'd fought for his worth and won. Ruth faded to a whisper, her cottage a distant speck, and I felt no guilt. Only freedom. I'd hauled firewood 4 feet high for her, fixed her life while she broke mine but no more. The shop's buzz, the garden's yield, the dance of our hands washing dishes. These were my strength. Not her scorn. Maggie and I waltzed in the living room some nights, the radio crackling 5 feet from the couch, her head on my chest like it'd been at that first barn dance. I'm back, Jack, she'd whisper, and I'd hold her tighter, the old spice she loved mingling with the earth on her skin. For seniors, life's about roots. Family, trust. The quiet victories of time. And I'd planted deeper than Ruth could uproot. Standing in that barn, tools in hand, Maggie by my side, I wasn't just a man who'd endured. I was a man who'd thrived, 35 years strong under the Oregon sky.